Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C. As the great Ronald Reagan would call this, the island surrounded by reality. And that's okay, because all of you are from reality, and we welcome you here. This is probably the largest gathering of conservatives to talk about free market issues in the city here in D.C. in quite some time. And we have a great guest here who is in the city, but not of the city, if you know what I mean, here in Washington. And it's a real hero of ours on policy issues that's been fighting the good fight in the U.S. Senate, and Senator Mike Braun from Indiana. A state that works. We have a great Indiana delegation led by our great board member, Senator Jim Buck, former national chairman of ALEC. And Senator Braun, you've led on so many issues here in Washington. It's a challenging time for free market folks like in this room in the last couple of years, to say the least. And I think as folks were out campaigning, probably the biggest issue they kept hearing about is the 40-year high inflation numbers that we see every single month reported once again. And of course, we know the driver of that is overspending and debt. So you've been a great leader on Budget Committee here in the Senate, trying to get back to some sane principles of budgeting, because all of you know, you all have to balance your budgets. Here in Washington, we don't even attempt to balance a budget or craft a budget. Senator Braun, what's the way out here in Washington?
Well, Jonathan, it's interesting because when I gavel in for the Budget Committee, Bernie Sanders is holding the gavel. Yes. And we've not done one meeting in 2 years on the mechanics of budgeting. It's been one woke issue after another. And I'm one that believes you got to wrestle on the issues of the day. I get along with the other side of the aisle mostly to make sure that we don't get walloped by some of the stuff they concoct, like the Green New Deal. Their holy grail would be that and Medicare for all. I want to reform health care. I did it in my own business. Anyone want to figure out how to fix health care? 15 years ago, I made it consumer driven. I got my employees engaged in their own well-being. I was big enough to self-insure. We've not had a premium increase in 15 years. That could be done at state level and out here. What do you run into? The biggest lobbies in the country, both back home and here. Hospitals, pharma, insurance, the Darth Vader that keeps it all glued together. We need more of us doing that. When it comes to our argument should be so easy. I learned it all when I decided to move back to my hometown, avoiding Wall Street back in the late 70s. Took about an 80% pay cut to raise a family, and my wife and I both were entrepreneurs. We didn't know it at the time. She got started 3 years before I did. You have those kinds of roots and throw in an economics degree, which I never thought would come in handy on a macro sense. Wow. Debated Bernie Sanders on the floor of the Senate about this modern monetary theory, which is an excuse to borrow money from our kids and grandkids for their latest and greatest idea. Sadly, we're not going to get ahead of this currently. It's going to get worse out here before it gets better. But the bastion of hope is among our states. And I know that because I served as a state legislator for 3 years. We believe in rainy day funds, balanced budgets, regular order. We took through Ways and Means. We listened to 50 stakeholders before we'd craft a budget. We're going to begin that back in Indiana again here in January. So it's not difficult to see what works. It takes the political will to try to get some of that to rub off out here.
No doubt. Well, think about that for a second, what he just started with there. How terrifying of a thought is that, to think that the person who chairs the Budget Committee in Washington, D.C. is none other than Bernie Sanders, by the way, which Bernie Sanders, Vermont, is the very only state in America that does not have a balanced budget requirement in its state's constitution or in statute. So think about that for a minute, and you wonder why we're in the problem that we are in Washington, D.C. today. Let's talk federalism, because you've been a leader in that area as well, in the Article 5 movement. I know we have our friend David Bidoff with us here in the audience, and thinking through that to see how can states utilize the Article 5 approach potentially to push back against the overspending and the federal debt problems that we have.
Never would have figured that that would be come into relevance, but thank goodness for the founders. Thomas Jefferson always impressed me with all that he did, including he in Washington hurrying back to Mount Vernon and Monticello after they served 2 terms. We need term limits out here worse than you could ever imagine. That and a convention that would talk about term limits and a balanced budget, because this place is never going to self-correct. It's got so many incentives, along with being rewarded for bad behavior and performance with a better pension every 2 years you're here after being here 4 years. Senator Rick Scott and I have tried to get rid of the pension program here. That's an incentive to double down on bad policy. Maybe the only tool, because when people ask me how's this going to end up, I'm truthful, and I got a good idea how it's going to end up. When we're now touting $1.5 trillion annual deficits, mostly driven by programs we hold dear, Social Security and Medicare. Medicare would be the easiest to fix if you'd reform the industry like I did. No appetite to do it. And I had to take a balanced budget amendment to the floor as a privileged motion here a few months ago and made it a chip shot, doing it over 10 years. My friend Rand Paul has really got the best idea, where you do it over 4 or 5 years. That would be easy for a state legislature. Any CEO that has the rigor of competition and all of that to go along with running something. So I don't think it's going to happen on its own. I think we're going to keep doubling down and getting back to that balanced budget proposal. 15 Republicans voted against it, which is a thing that really irked me. And that's due to the fact that it's the unholy alliance out here in the way things do get done. Is defense is the most important thing we do as a federal government. It should not be sacrosanct, should not be immune to audits within their own departments and doing budgets themselves. They roll us every time because Dems don't care how much you spend at the federal level. They lure us into, and like after all the trillions we spent due to COVID, they agreed to a 6.2% budget increase for defense and domestic and did it about 4 months after the fiscal year expired. So we're going to need that tool, and it's sad that it would have come to that, to where you wouldn't do it proactively and preemptively. I don't think the folks leading the place will do that.
I'm glad you mentioned the balanced budget amendment, because if you're looking and you don't think your state balanced budget amendment is quite good enough, Indiana's the model, I think, to look at. The most recent state to pass a balanced budget amendment, a fantastic piece of ALEC model policy as well. To double down on one more federalism-related question, people in this audience, I think, correctly saw the real problems and the writing on the wall with the ARPA funds, and now all these federal funds sloshing around in your state budgets. We've seen this movie before. The Obama bailout of the states caused us irreparable harm when it comes to the maintenance of effort requirements and all kinds of other problems and restrictions at any time a federal dollar goes to the states, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch, as the great Milton Friedman would remind us. And one of those strings was that unbelievably Janet Yellen and U.S. Treasury came back and said, well, if you take the federal money, you're not going to be able to cut taxes anymore. And you led the effort to push back against that, and it was a really incredible effort. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, let's look at the underlying principle where you'd make a statement like that. Rahm Emanuel, very clear, unapologetic, never let a crisis go to waste. And they have enterprised on that, including having the gall to say that if you do take the money, when it was kind of forced into a lot of places, I had commissioners calling me, what can we do with this? We really don't need it. And then you get that kind of statement. That's the heavy-handed, arm of this place, vaccine mandates. We led against that crazy idea of forcing businesses down to 100 employees to have to get their employees a vaccine or they lose their job. So that, of course, was going to be nothing more than messaging, because the folks running the show now, easiest way to understand the difference between what you do and what I do. This is the cathedral and the growth business all wrapped into one. And the people running it have never taken Finance 101, let alone any macroeconomics. And they don't care, because the policies to change the country from that more progressive, top-down approach, they do it when the moment and the opportunity arises. So All the things we talk about, all the things I've been able to do, sadly, is mostly messaging, because it's going to take the other point of view when that window of opportunity opens up for us to articulate why none of that stuff works, why borrowing money from your kids and grandkids is a bad long-term business plan. Where is our articulation? Where are we? We don't need to be political entrepreneurs. We just need to be less flat-footed. And look at this. Where have we ever drugged 10 to 15 Democrats along in the last 50 years? I asked Senator Cornyn from Texas, can you think of one bill? He said, Mike, I cannot think of it. They do that all the time. And until we get better at reversing that, we're going to get more of the craziness.
So let's talk taxes for a minute. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is something you spent a lot of time talking about, and we're a leader on. You know, that was the first federal tax reform in 31 long years. In fact, the original Top Gun was #1 at the box office. This is the last time that Ronald Reagan's tax reform passed in 1986. Here we go, 2017, signed into law, was an incredible boost to the economy, as we all witnessed after that was signed by President Trump. Now, of course, there's the timeline that the U.S. Senate rules put on these things, so all of the individual provisions of that go away at the end of 2025 if nothing is done here in D.C. to permanently extend those tax cuts. We've got an ALEC model resolution that's already passed in Arizona, in Michigan, being introduced elsewhere to call on Congress to reevaluate this to make sure that these are made permanent. So what's the status of that here in Washington?
There'll be zero interest in it under the current political structure. The Dems don't like that. They aren't really worried about borrowing the money because they do that fairly easily, but they are going to, just to say that they wanted to do something on the revenue side, probably let that lapse. We can't really put that back into place until we have the presidency in both chambers and do it through a process called reconciliation. That's a gimmick they've used here to avoid real budgeting, where only 50 would be needed in the Senate if you control the presidency, which is how they got a lot of their completely partisan big spending bills through. Again, they enterprised and got it done. So we'll have to wait. That's why 2024 is so critical. Otherwise, we'd have to live with it potentially for another 4 years until 2028. That was an hallelujah moment. When I was back home, that was when I was running for U.S. Senate, by the way, when that passed. I think that was in maybe December of 2017. That was the biggest kind of unleashing of economic activity among the enterprisers across the country. Thank one U.S. Senator, Senator Ron Johnson, a feisty guy from Wisconsin that just won another close race up there. He held the system up and was not going to let that go through unless Main Street was taken care of. We are the LLCs and the sub-S's, the proprietorships and the partnerships. Obviously, the C Corps got taken care of. And that was from 35 down to, 21 now? That, sadly, is more in line with the current politics and leadership, would be big corporations disregarding what made our country great, which is Main Street. So we've got some uncertainty there. That is something that we do need to get back. Otherwise, it was a 20% cut. The arithmetic means that would be a 25% increase if you put it back in. So
that's a great point. So many of those provisions, whether it was the rates, it was the SALT deduction, the subsidy to the high tax states would come back unlimited. You'd have the child care tax credit expansion go away, the standard deduction doubling, all of those things on the individual side would go away. NFIB is a great partner of ours. I know you're an NFIB member. You just won the Guardian Award again. But talk about that uncertainty for the small business owners, given those tax breaks that would go away if nothing's done.
You know, for small business owners, let's take farming, for instance. I got involved after I moved back to Indiana in farming as a tree farmer. That's an optimist when you're planting trees as an investment, and it's great therapy for my new job. And I got involved in agriculture that way. And then in the row crop side of it, that is the toughest small business that God ever created. You throw the weather in there to boot. Those dynamics are similar across Main Street. My wife has had her own business this really dates us, I think 78 to the present, you can do the math, it's a lot of years. She's down on Main Street with a home accessory and gift store. Our state government declared her non-essential, by the way, back when we were going through the COVID thing. But everything kind of works against Main Street and small stakeholders. That's why they need you. They need NFIB. They need guys like me that have come from that pathway, because the big guys always get taken care of. And small business is, again, they don't generally have lines of credit. The biggest thing about small business owners, they're making a living out of the business. They're not thinking about a return on investment generally. And totally different dynamic from where I thought I was going to head back in the late 70s, maybe to Wall Street or to be a captain of industry. I came back to my hometown to raise a family, start a business, and it worked out over time. Small business is generally going to get a lot of lip service, but when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, if it hadn't been for Ron Johnson, we wouldn't have gotten anything out of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act back in December of 17.
Well, big topic here to discuss, ESG, something, who's here concerned about the radicalized version of ESG that's playing out all across the country? We're going to hear more about this in a minute from our next panel, but you've been a leader on this. As you may have seen just recently, the Biden administration's DOL, Department of Labor, overturned a Trump-era rule that was, I think, so important to try to keep politics out of pensions. And some of you may know, I expect across the states, nearly every state to adopt a new ALEC model policy, trying to keep politics out of state pension systems and taking from that Scalia and the Trump approach. You filed an amendment to try to stop what the Biden administration is doing. So just talk about how important that is on the ESG piece, but also especially on the pension side to keep politics out of pensions.
Well, it's important. It's taking a lot of the woke policies. And I said earlier, we've got to be involved in those issues, or you're going to get blindsided and walloped with craziness like we've witnessed. But when you're going to be that blatant about how you want to craft the country through these big levers that they enjoy and exercise here well, to where you'd sacrifice actually the essence of what retirement's about. It's what kind of return are you going to get on your hard-earned assets? And then they want to water it down because they want to enforce climate policies when China's laughing at us on those things. You know, they're not paying any attention. They're building a coal-fired plant weekly. They get covered as still a developing country, get a 10-year break on any of that stuff. And here, through our largest corporations, they embrace it. It's the same thing that happened when we shut down our energy independence. Regardless of what you'd want to do in the long run about climate, and I think it's an issue we got to be engaged in, you would not shoot yourself in the foot like we did and take energy independence that would have taken us out of all the pickles we're currently contending with. Not having to kowtow and beg in Venezuela, in Saudi Arabia, and not put us in probably the predicament we're in with the dynamic on energy in Ukraine and Russia. All of that has implications, and if we keep pushing that went through the committee tied, so it didn't go anywhere. There's zero interest on the other side of the aisle to do anything that's going to diminish their efforts on ESG.
And there is one bright spot. Just this week, I know we got a lot of my home staters from Michigan here. Senator Jim Runstead of the Michigan Senate Finance Committee yesterday passed the ALEC model to keep ESG and politics out of Michigan's pension system, out of the Michigan Senate Finance Committee. Give it a round of applause for our Michigan folks there. It's not states all across the country have billions of dollars of unfunded liabilities. This would only make it much worse, is to have politics enter the equation. So such a big topic going forward, and thank you for your fight on that in Washington.
And farmers, by the way, are being told by their suppliers on scope 2 and 3, which is this idea so far down kind of the ripple effect trail, and they have no idea how they'd kind of generate that information or quantify it. And that is a possibility. So with all that they're contending with, that's another thing to worry about.
Now, in our last couple of minutes here, I know there's been a few rumors swirling around town here in the media, and I'm not going to ask you any political questions today, Senator. But should you have your focus more in Indianapolis in the future, what would your state policy goals look like for Indiana, potentially in a hypothetical way?
I'm surprised it took to the last question to ask that. But So when I became a state legislator, I was on a school board 10 years. That might be the most important entry-level position, and we weren't wrestling with critical race theory, masking kids, trying to teach them from afar. When I did run, I'm a huge believer in term limits. I was not going to do it more than 2 terms. I was not going to run for a 3rd term as a state legislator. I'm a big believer in the principles the founders put out there. Be a citizen legislator. Don't make a career out of it. So at my stage of the game, I calculate each additional year that God gives me with great interest and concern. Still feel like I'm in my 50s, but the chronology says otherwise. So I'm going to be one that doesn't want to fix something that isn't broken. But even in our own state, you got to tackle tough issues. Like, I don't like the idea that we've got high infant and maternal mortality rates. We're the 4th or 5th highest hospital costs in the country. I reformed that in my own business. We could do that in state, and some of the legislators here are already working on it. I'm going to be an entrepreneur. If I decide to do that, that'll be public here in a couple weeks. And here, the biggest issue is you got to be here 2 decades, not just 2 terms. And in the 2 years I've got left, I'm going to robustly finish them out. I'm going to question leadership that's been running the place, even in our own party, and do it in an entrepreneurial way. And if I do decide to come back to Indiana, I think it'll be clear what I'm going to want to do as a governor, to take a great state and make it even better by tackling issues most would avoid because they're too dicey. So you'll hear in a couple weeks.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Senator Braun, for your continued great work. It's a pleasure.